Well, I've been a member of the organization for quite some time, but I've never had the opportunity to have breakfast with you, and I really am pleased to be able to be here. When I accepted this invitation to speak, little did I know that an assemblyman by the name of John Berzicelli was going to introduce a bill for death with dignity in New Jersey. And so this is going to be an issue that is going to be something that is quite current rather than something that has been going on for a long time. You may remember or know that the Death with Dignity Acts only have been passed in 3 states, and that is originally Oregon in 1997, 2009 took that long for it to be passed in Washington, and soon after that in Montana. And that's it. On the ballot in November in Massachusetts is a Death with Dignity Act, which we hope will be passed. But that's it. So that we as humanists, if you agree with the idea of worth and dignity, and that everybody is entitled to make decisions for themselves without any religious sanctions or prohibitions or commandments, this is one of the things that you probably would want to agree with. On the other hand, this issue has been very much tied into religion. And way back, St. Augustine talked about the fact that the commission of suicide defied God's commandment of thou shalt not kill, and it was one of the worst sins that somebody could do. And the church has continued to be opposed to anything referable to suicide, assisted suicide, up until this very day. So again, we are dealing with a religious issue. One of the other things that was important in this issue was the doctor who has always been told, first, do not harm, and that the way that physicians are supposed to act is to do whatever they possibly could to survive and to provide life. And it's interesting that you talked about the fact that I'm a fertility specialist, but in my mind, the ability to give life should give the ability to give death, because it's all part of the same continuum. So that from that point of view, we have a group of physicians who are opposed to this and are opposed to the fact that they are being asked to get involved with this decision. There was a well-known playwright in about 1600 who also talked about one of the major reasons why suicide was a major issue, and the conflict between the advantages of suicide and the doubts that might be worse. And I'm going to ask my wife, Pat Debrovner, to read you a short talk that this physician, this playwright authored, and you'll see how pertinent it might be.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus, conscience doth make cowards of us all.
So there we have the issue. And interestingly, not knowing anything about it until my daughter told me today in the New York Times yesterday, there's a story about a terminally ill woman by the name of Sung-Un Grace Lee, and whether or not a respirator should be removed that is providing life support for her. And the issue is whether or not her own wishes will be kept, or whether or not her parents claim that they know better and that her wish was that she wanted to continue to live. Now, this initial story involves something called passive euthanasia. Now, passive euthanasia was not arrived at easily. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until 1976 that the Karen Quinlan case established in the state of New Jersey the patient's right to life-sustaining medical treatment and the right to refuse it if she chose to. Quinlan was in a persistent vegetative state, having imbibed drugs and alcohol, and by the time she was 21 years old, she was already in a persistent state, and the court appointed her father as her legal guardian, and he petitioned the court to remove the respirator that was supporting her life. And this wish was opposed by her doctors, by the hospital, by the county prosecutor, and by the state of New Jersey. So he went to court, and the trial court decided that the doctors were right and refused her father's wish to remove the respirator. However, the New Jersey Supreme Court reversed the decision, stating that she had the constitutional right of privacy and that this included the right to refuse treatment, and that the decision could be made by a guardian. So this was the first case, 1976, where a guardian or a patient, by advance directive, could say that I will not accept the use of equipment to keep my life going. And various other courts' decisions from that point defined the kinds of refusal. First, there were life support systems such as a respirator, then it was intravenous feeding, and finally there were feeding tubes and various other kinds of artificial feeding device. And then they decided in various court decisions, well, who had the right to do this, what kind of legal instruments had to be drawn up, what kind of guardian would be able to make these decisions, so that this was an evolving issue which started fairly recently. Now, initially, these decisions gave such rights only to people who were considered to be terminally ill. However, and perhaps the most significant decision since the Karen Quinlan case, the 1986 case And you haven't heard this much about this. You've heard about Terry Schiavo, you've heard about Nancy Cruzan, but this case, the case of Elizabeth Bouvier, was perhaps one of the most important cases in this area. And the case of Bouvier versus the Superior Court of California was the first case in the United States to establish the withdrawal of a feeding tube from a patient who was not terminally ill. And Elizabeth Bouvier was 28 years old when this happened, and the case involved this woman who, from birth, was a quadriplegic. And it became progressively worse till at the age of 28, she could barely move more than the fingers of one hand and had some movements of her head and some facial movements. And she had been in a public hospital and required help from outside for everything that she had to do. And she eventually, for whatever the reasons, perhaps the fact that she had chronic arthritis and was in constant pain and had a gadget attached to her chest which would produce a certain amount of morphine periodically to eliminate her pain. Eventually, perhaps the dose got too high and she became nauseous and vomiting and stopped feeding. And therefore, when she could no longer tolerate feeding, the doctors decided to put a nasogastric tube down and feed her through the tube. And she had, when she was able to express herself, refused this. She did not want to do this, but it was done against her will. So now she had this nasogastric tube in, and she decided that she did not want to do this, and she received help from lawyer friends, things of that sort, and went to court. And the case was taken to the Court of Appeal, and the appeal court held that forced insertions of tubes in her body against her wishes violated her constitutional rights. And they said that we do not believe that it's the policy of this state that all and every life must be preserved against the will of the sufferer. It's incongruous, if not monstrous, for medical practitioners to assert their right to preserve a life that someone else must live, or else more accurately endure for 15 or 20 years. So this was the first case now where somebody who was not terminally ill achieved the right to terminate their life when they decided that it was intolerable for them. And at about this same time, legislation was being brought about where people could have advanced directives, where people could say, if in the event of an accident, or if I am in a situation where I need life support, I refuse to do it, and that these directives had to be respected. Now, note that in this, as well as all previous legislation, it involves passive euthanasia. In the Bouvier versus Superior Court case, the concurring opinion written by a judge by the name of Lynn Compton noted that Elizabeth apparently has made a conscious and informed choice that she prefers death to a continued existence in her helpless and to her intolerable condition. I believe that she has the absolute right to effectuate that decision. This state and the medical profession, instead of frustrating her desire, should be attempting to relieve her of her suffering by permitting her, and in fact assisting her, to die. The fact that she is forced to suffer an ordeal of self-starvation to achieve her objective is indeed humane. The right to die is an integral part of our right to control our own destinies, as long as the rights of others are not affected. The right should, in my opinion, include the ability to enlist assistance from others, including the medical profession, in making death as painless as possible. In response to this thinking and to the persistent efforts of another name that you all know, Dr. Jack Kevorkian, who was very active in promoting this, a group in California called Citizens Against Human Suffering proposed a legislation called a Death with Dignity Act. And this was first brought up in California in 1988, and it was made as an initiative and brought before the public in a general election, and it failed. And this was 1988. And that's how things stayed for quite some time. And these measures did not become enacted until the first act in 1999, and then later in 2007 in Washington, and then soon after that in Montana. And these measures would permit terminally ill but competent adults who were residents of that state, who are medically predicted to die within 6 months, to request self-administration of lethal medications prescribed by physicians. And this is the Death with Dignity Act that is now being decided about in Massachusetts, and we'll see what happens in New Jersey. It may or may not have to get past the governor, which may not be too possible. The measure requires 2 oral and 1 written request, 2 physicians to diagnose the patient and determine that she's competent, with mental health consultation if necessary, a waiting period, and a physician's certification of an informed patient's decision without coercion and with all of the alternatives considered. Physicians, patients, and other health providers who were involved with this would be immune from any legal penalties. The living wills that currently exist and that which exists in all of the other 47 states that we have now allow for passive euthanasia. They involve the removal of a feeding tube, the removal of a respirator, and that allows the patient to either starve to death or suffocate. And the issue that we are talking about now is an entirely different concept, where instead of this, the patient in that situation or somebody who finds that their life situation is such that they are anticipating within the next 6 months that they're going to die, the right to make the determination as to when that is going to be, how they want the circumstances to be with their family and whatever it may be, and to request aid by a physician to prescribe medications that allow them to do this. So this is active euthanasia, and this is the newer concept that we're talking about. Death, obviously, for all of us is inevitable. But one might ask, what makes a good death? This is a very personal, individual decision. It's never something that one particularly looks forward to. But to quote Robert Riesling, who was one of the original fellows who drew up the original Death with Dignity Acts, he stated that a good death is a painless and peaceful exit from life. A good death is if suffering and pain are present, the patient finds them intolerable. A good death involves deliverance with trained professional help. A good death involves the ability to choose, to control, and to be as autonomous as possible. A good death is where one has time to discuss the decision with one's family, to be able to say a fond farewell, and to celebrate the closing of a worthwhile life with a dignified and serene death at the time of their own choosing. Interestingly, Elizabeth Bouvier, having won her case in court, did not choose to have the feeding tube removed, and she died later on. In Washington, since 2009, there have been 200 people who have committed suicide based on this legislation. In Oregon, where the legislation goes back to 1999, it's 15 years, there have only been 600 people who chose assisted suicide. So this is something that has not been something that has been chosen by a large number of people, but an awful lot of people who have the right, who have been given the right to do this, have a feeling of control, a feeling of autonomy, a feeling of saying that life and death is in my hands. And sometimes that allows them to go on further in the situation that they're in. So that even if you look at the figures and say, gee, this involves a very small number of people, the fact that such legislation exists will give people another alternative as to how they're about to face their situation. One of the other things that we might want to talk about a little bit, especially since this is Freethought Day and we are looking at new ways perhaps of looking at our world vision, I'd like to make perhaps a somewhat more radical proposal, and that's that all of these proposed Death with Dignity Acts, which are only passed in 3 states now, maybe 5 eventually, involve terminally ill patients, patients who are making a decision for how they want to die when they know that death is going to be more or less inevitable in 6 months. Are these the only people for whom we feel should have this right? Are there not people with Lou Gehrig's disease? Are there not people who are quadriplegics? Are there not people in all sorts of other situations who, having made a rational decision that their quality of life is not such that they wish to endure, not the kind of life situation that they want their family to endure or their loved ones to endure, to see them in this condition, should they not have the same right to a legal access to physician assistance in suicide? I would be very interested. I cut out half my talk because I really wanted to discuss this with you. I'd like to get your feelings about how you feel about this. One of the people who has written about this is a Dr. Arthur Kaplan. Arthur Kaplan was the chairman of the Bioethics Department of the University of Pennsylvania, and he's now currently the chairman of medical ethics at New York University Medical Center and New York University. And he's also on the advisory board of our Bioethics Center, which is called Global Bioethics Initiative, which has taken over from the Appignani Center when the AEHA decided that they did not want to have a presence in New York in this area. So we are the organization that now represents the same thought processes at the United Nations that they are. So that's where we are now. So Art Kaplan was concerned about 2 things, and I throw these out to you because I would like your thoughts about them. One, that suicide should not be a first resort. Suicide is a last resort. And with this in mind, there are 2 major issues that have to be thought about in terms of how one might perhaps craft legislation to allow people to have this right, where competence to make the decision is an issue, and whether or not legislation in this direction will lead to what one might call a slippery slope. Now, competence is the issue where if somebody decides that my life is terrible, I want to commit suicide, if you decide that all they have to be is competent, means that they're not crazy and they're educated enough to discuss this with you, does that mean that they have been given sufficient counseling to look at all of the alternatives to see whether or not there are ways that their life situation could be made more tolerable? Are there situations where medication could be used? somebody gets depressed, they decide they want to die, suicide should not be the first alternative. It should be the last alternative. So establishing some legislative framework to decide that somebody's competent is a very difficult issue. The other area that he talks about is the slippery slope. We've been seeing debates, one so far, but we'll see more, about healthcare and our healthcare system, and how our healthcare system is going to run out of money, and that medical costs in the last 6 months of life represent a tremendous burden on society insofar as Medicare and various other kinds of insurances. And how are we going to protect somebody from, well, you know, this is legal, you're going to die anyway, why don't you do it now? Your family is in great distress with the economic bills. If you committed suicide tomorrow, maybe you'll be able to send your grandchild to college. I mean, there are all sorts of things that one might do to make the decision as to, once you start this process, where does it stop, and how are you going to make this determination? So that this is another area that we need to think about in terms of deciding. That somebody has the right, as far as I'm concerned, to make this decision for themselves, to have the autonomy to make a decision as to how they choose to die, as far as I'm concerned, is a right that they have and that everybody else should have. And I welcome your discussion. Now, I know that it's 20 of 3, and I cut out a lot of the talk because I wanted to provoke you a little bit, so I like some talk. Yes?
Well, the slippery slope argument is always an idiotic argument, because it means that you can't do anything. That's what the slippery slope is. In other words, if we can do A, then we can do B. You know, it's like with the Affordable Care Act for Scalia. They were saying, well, if the government could force you to buy life insurance and health insurance, then it's going to force you to eat broccoli. Now, that's an idiotic argument, because that means that you cannot have any kind of form. Or if we allow people to commit suicide, well, the next thing you know, if we allow gay men and women to marry, next thing people will want to marry horses. You know, so that slippery slope argument is just idiotic.
Okay. Sir?
Also, experience. The Death with Dignity Acts have led to the deaths of very, very few people, in fact. And those people have been, I believe, comparatively well educated in comparison to the population, and in reasonable economic circumstances. So there has not been proof of that pressure to force euthanasia on people who are considered a burden on society. It just hasn't happened, I believe.
Well, these are people, obviously, as I say, who are terminally ill, and it's a somewhat different situation. But yes, we have to decide that if it's so easy to commit suicide or to allow somebody to die, the slippery slope that is proposed is, well, okay, fine. We're not going to try so hard to keep this person alive. Think of all the money we're going to save and such. It shouldn't be that way. And the question is, how can we give people the right to do this and yet protect them from this kind of thinking? John?
The slippery slope and the where do we go from here, the whole concept behind those feelings comes down to suicide being wrong, suicide being a sin, suicide, and this is the religious hangover. When you think about it, take religion out of the equation. If suicide does not involve hurting other people, why the hell should there be any restrictions on it? Why can't anybody make the decision to end their own life? whenever they please. Now, you can then say, well, what about someone who is temporarily crazy? Yeah, sure, it gets to be a problem. But
That's the company
when you take religion out of the equation entirely, and why can people commit suicide?
There's no
Whatever the hell
future
they
in
want.
There's no future in it.
Sir.
I think that John's argument makes sense from a libertarian framework of the government makes no decisions for you, but that's not the world we live in. The government makes decisions for you that it's not wise to take heroin, and the government goes to great lengths to prevent you from taking heroin. And there are a whole bunch of decisions that you could make that only affect you and that affect no one else, where the government steps in and says, no, we know what's best for you better than you do. And suicide is just another one of those cases.
You and John have just hit upon what I was going to next ask the audience to provoke you, is the concept of victimless crimes. And suicide is considered to be a victimless crime. But there are two other victimless crimes. One is heroin addiction, and the other is prostitution. And the question is, if you decide that suicide is a victimless crime that everybody has the right to, why can I not use my body in the way that I choose? If I want to take heroin and I can afford it, and it won't be so expensive because the only reason it's expensive is because it's illegal and everybody's making a lot of money in supplying it. If I choose to become a heroin addict, like I chose to be an alcoholic, which was, again, once upon a time illegal, or if I decide that I want to be a prostitute, and that's what I want to do with my body, and I think I can do some psychotherapy on the basis of being a good prostitute, why not do so? How do you feel about this? Are these victimless crimes that you think should also be eliminated from the legal lexicon? Sir, we'll go around.
I think, contrary to assisted suicide, the other two have social consequences. They do affect the larger social body. And I think that was one of the reasons I argued against John's position. I forgot what we were discussing in one of the former journals. You raised the question, someone said, oh, marijuana.
Oh, yeah.
Doing away with marijuana.
What are the social consequences, sir?
Yeah, well, the cost of it to society is one.
What cost? The cost of I'm buying. I mean,
We
because
have-
because that I'm buying it.
No, if these people end up in the hospital, we have to pay for it. There are social consequences.
Oh, wait a second.
I mean, if you want detailed analysis, I'm not prepared to give it to you now, but my feeling is that it does. When you yourself decide to die, whether it's assisted or not, your family is affected. But if you're an addict or you're a prostitute, it does have larger ramifications. It is the stone thrown into the water that has wider consequences. I don't think that you can make an exact parallel with assisted suicide. That's my point.
Okay. Others? Wait a second. Yes. Ana.
I was going to disagree with John. I think the government has a legitimate interest in you staying alive, working and paying taxes.
Okay.
Several years ago, I saw, I forget, what program it was, but something about a doctor in Australia who assisted suicide, and one of the people was a woman who decided she didn't want to live past her 80th birthday. She just thought that was enough to live. She was not in bad health or anything, and I mean, I don't, if it were I would, wonder what condition I'm in when I'm 80, because I know some people who live way past there and they're fine. But I very strongly feel that if I should be diagnosed with something like Alzheimer's, I would want to do away with myself while that narrow period of time when you're still cogent and can make the decision. I just don't, and a lot of it is the cost. When my sister was in a vegetative state and she was getting dialysis, every day must have cost a fortune, and her husband didn't understand. He thought, she never would breathe again, but he said, oh no, she just has bad doctors, she'll be better. And I finally had to talked to him about it, and they were going to put a feeding tube in, and they didn't. But I mean, I don't really see. I think that suicide is bad if you're doing it to get even with your parents or something. Really, if there are people who are still alive, you really, might be miserable. I think you might want to think about it. But if you're not in that situation, you're past a certain age. I just don't want to ever be in a nursing home or anything like that. Whether I could live another 20 years or not.
The very first patient that Jack Kevorkian assisted in suicide was a woman who was in early stages of Alzheimer's, who looked forward to that situation, and he assisted her to die because that's what she wanted. The issue, of course, is this whole problem of quality of life, and everybody has a different concept of quality of life, and who's going to make that decision? Probably not the person who has a vendetta that I'm going to assist in suicide and I'm going to convince the world of this. This decision should be made by somebody else, perhaps, but it may be a very valid decision to make, though. Yes, sir.
So here's the problem as far as like with say smoking, marijuana. Okay, it is a drug. I mean, it does have bad health effects on the person's lung. I mean, it's not maybe as bad as doing crystal meth or even maybe perhaps heroin, but it does have health effects, and then it's bad on the lungs, and a person can develop whatever diseases, and then he has to get treated. And then that's like, if there's going to be like socialized medicine, then the taxpayers are going to have to pay for that.
What about?
So that's one kind of. So it's not like it's just like an isolated. I'm doing it, sort of libertarian point of view. It does have ripple effects. The other problem that I have with the slippery slope, and as far as assisted suicide as well. What if you have a person who's not intellectually competent? I mean, if you have like an IQ of say 60 or something, then are you competent enough then to make a decision of suicide? And especially if you're under the care of the state or something like that, where you don't have family or something like that to look after you, then should that person, let's say a low IQ, like 60 or whatever, be able to make the choice?
The issue of competence is a very difficult one to define in some sort of law. Richard?
I think of it as a humanist. I see the arguments for libertarian, it's your own body, your own decision, you have to be able to do that. But really, truly in life, we're not an island to ourselves. We're interconnected, we're involved with each other. There's costs associated with that, and the government, if it's going to be involved in an issue like this, that there has to be some. I mean, this is exactly what we do. We do a discussion with everybody to kind of come up with it. Life is not quite so black and white. We can't come up with a affirmative thing for every situation. But I think if government is going to be involved with it, we should make this very difficult to actually do.
Yeah.
That we make
The last resort
higher,
rather than the first resort.
that,
Yes.
Yeah, we make it the last resort, and that it's very difficult for that to actually happen. There's should be some hoops to be able to go through it. So we make sure that the due diligence is done for that, and that if we also maybe allowing people to make those decisions on a personal level, that I understand. If I was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and I knew I was going to get bad and I was going to have a horrible point, that I do want to actually have that decision to not wait till it's the worst. If I'm living on public assistance or I'm in the hospital at the government's dime and stuff like that, it's going to obviously go a lot further than I would like it to want to go and stuff. But Alzheimer's is one of those things where your brain slowly goes, and it's like, at what point do you say it goes? So the slippery slope I understand, but then if government's going to be involved with it, we should really make it the last resort. It should be relatively difficult.
I can't talk to all three of the legislations, but at least in one of them, there's a 7-year period. So once that you've gotten permission to do this, you don't have to act on it right away. You can then look at your options and decide at some later point, knowing that you have the autonomy to do so, that at that point you do decide that you want to take that action. So that tries to answer your point, but it is a definite difficulty in terms of deciding that, all right, if you are given this right, you've got to do it right away or not at all. That certainly won't work.
Just to be clear, I want to, because I certainly agree with the Alzheimer's, and that would be my path. But you're talking about just, and this is an earlier point, getting medical assistance once you've decided this, right from the get. So this is assisted all the way. You're talking about assisted.
Yes.
Only. Okay.
Well, the answer is yes, and as I talked about before, about the fact that as a fertility doctor who is working to bring in life, how could I be on the other side of the coin? I think a lot of doctors feel that this is totally against what their concept of why they became physicians were, and you have to respect that. And therefore, I would feel that whatever legislation would be crafted would require a minimal involvement in the physicians in the process. As a matter of fact, in the Netherlands right now, the doctor may write a prescription, but he's remote from the rest of the situation. The doctor needs to decide, okay, fine, this is the patient's height and weight, this is the patient's basic condition, these are the medications that work, these are the doses that we're going to use, and he gives that prescription to some third party who then supervises and you probably have all seen the video of the couple who goes to the Netherlands and they check into a hotel, and there's a person who is the intermediary. And in fact, in that situation, they do it intravenously. But this could be done orally, so that the doctor doesn't have to be the one who's actually doing anything other than saying, okay, this is the proper dose, and perhaps doctors should be the ones who are involved at least in the decision making in terms of competence. Whether or not quality of life issues need to be decided, I don't think that has to be done by doctors. So I think that doctors should not be the ones who are involved in this decision. When they called Kevorkian Dr. Death, well, obviously that was a very derogatory term for as far as he was concerned. New people, yes. Caroline, you've been yielded to. Thank you, sir.
I have 2 points. One that I was thinking about on a very practical level is we haven't talked about the DNR, do not resuscitate. And on a practical level, do people have a card that they put in their wallet, like organ donation? If you are brought into the emergency room, how does that work? That's a kind of passive euthanasia that you didn't talk about.
So that's an advanced directive. That is correct.
An advanced directive,
That is
and it's
correct.
something that young people could,
Anybody can choose to do so. Unfortunately, your family can override that very often. In other words, if you have an advanced directive and you're a young person in an automobile accident, and you've directed the fact that not only don't want life support, but you want to donate your kidney, and your family says, no, I can't believe that anybody's going to cut into my son, I don't want you to do that, they can override the advanced directive.
if you're over 21?
Yes, unfortunately,
Really?
yes. If your family members, the hospital, see, right now you're dealing with a hospital. So by the time you go to court and get legal actions, it's too late to do anything about this because it has to be done right away.
But if you have do not resuscitate, like a card and like your wallet, like an organ donation, isn't that something that the hospital has to respect, like a DNR?
Hospital can, but in the real situation, it is not often done.
And then the other point that I wanted to make from a more philosophical point of view is, I don't think it's just taking religion out of the question. I think that there's a legal paternalism, that there's an uncomfortability in society with this idea that a life is not worth living. And as a OBGYN, if you had a patient who had prenatal testing and they found out that the child had a chromosomal disease, and the parents decided to terminate the pregnancy, thinking that they don't want that child to suffer, they don't want to suffer, and as parents, that they make that decision. And I think that, when I think back on Sarah Palin and how she got up there with her child who had, Down syndrome as, you know, part of the right to life, like this child's life is worth living. I think that there's a legal paternalism that we're uncomfortable with this idea of, you know, that we would be sending a message that a life is not worth living to people that are, you know, currently alive, and that the state is trying to sort of protect us psychologically from that scenario being sort of given the red stamp.
But in addition to the church, the largest other organization of people who are opposed to this are the organizations that to support the disabled. They don't want somebody else telling them that your life is not worth living.
The government has a death penalty.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean. And the third thing I was just going to bring up is that I was doing work in sentencing mitigation, and a recent case that I was on, there was a case where a death row inmate said, "I'm done. I don't want to have any more appeals. I want to die." And the lawyers that were so against the death penalty refused and kept giving him psychological counseling tests, saying that he was depressed. They would refuse to say, "Okay, I'm not going to do any more appeals." And that's sort of a right to die decision. It's kind of grotesque in the sense that we don't want the state to do that, but given, you know, that they were in a position that they were enduring death row, which is horrible, and the waiting, and that was another situation that recently came.
Art Kaplan talked about the fact that once it gets into court, it gets to be a win-lose situation,
Yeah.
which sometimes the actual situation gets lost in the winning or the losing. Sir?
Yeah, I'm wondering, first of all, I agree generally with the concept as it's perhaps practiced. I'm not familiar with it too much in the Netherlands, and that was expressed by some people to not make it illegal, but to require that there be some mechanism, screening mechanism, involving the person, the family, perhaps consultation with counselors and physicians before a person. That should be provided the person. The person should make an application, and then that would be a service that the person would avail him or herself of, and that would be a requirement before the final decision is made. But I have a question for you. I'm wondering how many doctors, I know there are some, are involved in assisting people to terminate their lives. Certainly it's illegal, but I know it's done, and I know many family members, sometimes in consultation with the patient, seek this help of a doctor who in fact does provide it. So what's your experience?
The answer is yes, there are. Next question to ask is, what doctors are doing this? And doctors who know the patient well, have been their doctor and their family's doctor for long periods of time, are more likely to do this than some fellow in a white coat who takes the case because he's an expert, doesn't know the patient, is much less likely to do so. The last time I researched this, about maybe 9 or 10 years ago, no doctor had ever been prosecuted for assisting in a suicide.
Chuck,
can I go directly to that?
Yeah, but we don't know the frequency. We don't
Oh,
know.
Well, a lot of people say, since it's being done, why not put it in codify it in some way and make it either legal or illegal?
Yeah, you can do an anonymous.
The ones we're talking about are celebrity cases. Celebrity in the sense that the media.
You're talking about Michael Jackson,
no,
right?
I meant the case you cited today about the Chinese young woman.
Oh, this case here.
These are celebrity cases because the media has grabbed them. But as you pointed out, if the doctor knows it and does it in a way that no one outside the media family does it, assisted dying, let's go on.
Yes, sir. John.
To the specific question about doctors' involvement, Donna and I are very close to a man who is a state senator in Vermont. And when the question came up in Vermont a few years ago, died, it did bad choice of words. But when the legislation did not advance, Mark told us that there were only 2 groups that actually lobbied in the state capitol against any proposal were different religious organizations that came in. On the other side, he said, were doctors and nurses. He said they had visits from literally hundreds of doctors and nurses who came individually and in groups to the state capitol to urge passage of this legislation, because they're the ones who actually see the people in extremis and said, this is, situation is nonsense. He said, but it boiled down to two things. He said, priests and ministers and rabbis on one side, doctors and nurses on the other. And it's simple as that. The people who actually had anything to do with it all said, give these people the right to die.
Mm-hmm. Well, you don't have a controlled series as to the number of doctors who didn't come, but that's.
Right.
But you're right. You're absolutely right. And as I say, on both sides of the question, I can see of why doctors might feel that way.
Yeah.
Sorry.
One of the problems is that, in my view, is there's a misuse often of the criminal law. And there are certain things that we consider criminal. There are other things that may be undesirable but are not criminal. Like, for example, if a person is grossly obese, he should be encouraged to lose weight and so on. We can use propaganda. But it would be wrong if you see a fat guy walk into a store and walk out with a candy bar to arrest him. Likewise, if a person drinks to excess, we could do what we can to try and stop him from drinking, but not make it a crime. It only becomes a crime if he gets behind the wheel of a car after drinking.
Mm-hmm.
So there are certain things that we could use: propaganda, health measures, economic supports, education, to fight certain problems. I don't think we should use the criminal statutes unless it's stopping a person from hurting another person.
Sir, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Well, I think the comment, it boils down to your original talk about having choice. And no matter what the situation, and you've described many situations, if you have some control of it, and your family has some control, and you point out the stats where people who have control have chosen to wait. So there is an element of stats on the books, and somebody pointed that out earlier, that shows that we're not going to get a rush of people, running into the sea to drown themselves or any other way. So if we can frame each situation with the proper controls, which means competency of the people, that's what the bottom line is. Whether then if it's in your own hands, you can.
In certain situations, the actually feeling of control may be therapeutic.
Yes.
That people who have various kinds of emotional situations, knowing that they have the right to do this, that they are the one who's in control of the situation, may be very therapeutic for them. Now, John, it's almost 7 after 3.
Give it a couple more?
Okay.
Just a couple more, and then we got
Okay, thank you.
I think that what people in this room are very unhappy with the law generally the way it is. Even if we would succeed in setting up a legal mechanism, some kind of a procedure, even say what kind of group would be deciding and what the legal criteria ought to be, I think even among us, forget about the opponents, but even among us, we would be likely to see many cases that we were extremely unhappy with the outcome. We cannot predict the future. We can talk about likelihood. In the end, it becomes a question of values. And the one thing that we will be sure is that there will always be pushback. So this is not an issue that can be resolved, I think, in any final way, or definitive way, rather. So we have to really find a way of addressing this in a very imperfect world and an imperfect social system, an imperfect political system, right, with very imperfect people, and I don't really begin to know what that might be.
Joel, that's a perfect New York Times editorial summary. Last word goes to our speaker.
Okay.
Thank you very much for having me. Interestingly, I worked very hard on 12 pages of information I was going to give you on how the Greeks felt about this and the Romans felt about this, but I'm much more happy to hear how you felt about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.